Welcome to There's Sometimes a Buggy, Irresponsible Opinions About Classic Film. I'm Elise.
I'm Dave, and welcome to episode 2 of our Diana Wynyard Acteurist Oeuvre-view. We'll be discussing two films from 1933, both made by MGM, Men Must Fight and Reunion in Vienna. After that, stay tuned for the long-awaited return of Fear and Moviegoing in Toronto. We saw Sleeping Beauty at the Review Cinema. Unfortunately, we do not have Leonard Maltin's input for Men Must Fight. It must not have been available in any way on TV or video in 1990. Elise will do the honors and give us director and the cast list. Maybe a little potted summary if you want to take a crack at your Maltin impression.
Pacifist drama predicts World War II.
Not bad.
Directed by Edgar Selwyn. The cast list here on Wikipedia is Diana Wynyard, Lewis Stone, Phillips Holmes, May Robson, who shows up in both of our movies, Ruth Selwyn, Robert Young, Robert Grieg, Hedda Hopper, Dawn Dillaway, Mary Carlisle, and Louis Alberni. Makes a memorable appearance in this movie, I think as comic relief. It's comic anyway.
He gets into a little bit of comic business with Robert Grieg, the butler. Later will become a beloved character actor in Hollywood, playing people like Louis, the owner of the Hotel Louis in Easy Living.
I question relief only because this movie doesn't give much relief.
No, it's pretty grim all the way through.
And it's very intense in the argument that it's presenting throughout. Both sides present it very, very intensely. So both of these movies, Dave, I found really oddball.
Yeah.
And interesting for that reason. Particularly never expected to see anything like Men Must Fight. This was just completely out of left field. I think maybe the greatest dramatic interest, besides Phillips Holmes' performance, which was really interesting, was whether the movie was really going to stick to its guns, its pacifist guns, or not. By the end, my impression was that, if anything, it was leaning more in the pacifist direction than in the other, although definitely presenting a whole lot of problems with that. I think ultimately presenting the whole thing as insoluble. It was based on a play by Reginald Lawrence and S.K. Lauren, a 1932 play, but the presence of screenwriter C. Gardner Sullivan, Charles Gardner Sullivan, who was a very important silent scenarist. He had worked on such films as Civilization, 1916, which is a pacifist drama, and All Quiet on the Western Front, 1930s. So I think we can take his presence as screenwriter on this film to indicate that the pacifist side is definitely being taken completely seriously.
I think what we could say in the way that the film develops, showing us the only way for pacifism to be successful is to stop the war from starting. Once it starts, you can't continue to be a pacifist when your country's being bombed. You could make a treaty, a disadvantageous treaty perhaps, but you can't just say, well, I'm not going to fight you.
Well, Diana Wynyard seems to think that you can.
She becomes out of touch at that point. Even though she's the top-billed actress. I mean, it really is about Phillips Holmes. He is a pacifist. He gets his principles from her. It follows and shows him sticking to his resolve, but when New York is starting to get gassed and bombed mercilessly by this fictional enemy that has also taken over the Panama Canal, there's not really anything he can do, even though he says this is a stupid war, it's a waste
of human life.
He still has to sign up and be a pilot.
Which is why it's so annoying to me when, as one of his reasons for doing so, he says there are certain things that men must do. Because this movie frames its argument in gendered terms that up to a certain point makes sense, but it never moves outside of that framing, right?
No, it ends with May Robson saying that the only way this is ever going to change is if women take over the government, which is maybe true. I don't know.
Yeah, it's certainly never come close to happening. Simply having women in the government doesn't do anything. They just become part of the military-industrial complex.
We'd have to have a preponderance of women running all branches of the government, maybe we'd see some changes. I would be eager to see that. The movie is a near future film, so that is very unusual, especially during the studio era. I can't really think of any other movies like this.
Unlike many a futuristic film with which we're familiar, sometimes even near future films, it actually predicts technology that's going to happen. It just happens to predict it much too soon, such as video calls and widespread use of television.
So the television is not so far off the mark. We're set in 1940 and television did exist. There even were stations broadcasting programming at that time, but almost no one had a TV, and it'd be very unlikely that a bunch of hooligans would be watching a peace rally in a bar in 1940. I think a television was much too expensive a thing to be sitting there waiting to have a beer stein thrown into it. And yeah, the video calls, they're off by about 70 years, but it did happen. The movie does start during World War I, and a lot of its sensibilities, of course, are coming out of that matrix. We meet Diana Wynyard and her paramour, Robert Young, an early role for him. He's billed pretty low in the cast, but he's pretty prominent while he's alive. They have met, had a whirlwind romance, had sex, clearly, because she's going to have his baby later. He's going off for his first assignment with his squadron in the Army Air Corps.
I thought that Robert Young was so cute in this tiny little scene. He's so baby-faced and so tender.
I mean, this is the way he was used by MGM a lot of the time, early on here.
To impregnate women in pre-coats and then die?
Well, no, but just to be a handsome man supporting a star.
Diana Wynyard obviously came by this role because of her role in Cavalcade.
That's right, and there are definite continuities there. She is preoccupied with the fact that history is conspiring to kill off everyone she cares about.
And she's in middle-aged makeup the whole time.
Yeah, except for the very early scenes where she's a nurse.
This is one of the absolute frankest sex out of wedlock situations I've ever seen, even in a pre-code.
This is not an unfamiliar plot line, though, where there's a man, an older man with no sexual appeal whatsoever, who's been haunting Diana Wynyard for her hand in marriage. She's been refusing him right along.
It's absolutely crazy. It manages to establish the incredible intensity of Wynyard's character right from the outset. The fact that she falls madly in love with and sleeps with a man after only 3 days of knowing him.
Well, that's wartime.
It may be wartime, but 3 days to fall in love for the rest of your life? If that's the intensity of wartime, she carries that intensity with her throughout the rest of the movie. One thing I did appreciate about her performance, because the characterization is pretty shrill, is that she could have been a lot whinier than she is. She's defiant and she's independent and she's angry and fierce.
No question. She's strong-willed at every turn, right? Even at the beginning, before Robert Young has died, when she orders him to find that four-leaf clover. I love that scene. I mean, it doesn't do him any good. He gets shot down and killed immediately. But...
yeah, this character and this performance are wildly intense.
Yes.
And the movie is wildly intense. Someone who's not wildly intense is Phillips Holmes.
Great performance from him as the son who was raised on pacifism by his mother. The whole period between the end of the war and 1940, when we pick up the story, she has been controlling everything. Lewis Stone agrees to marry her, even though she doesn't love him.
He offers to marry her.
He's excited to marry her, even though she's, I guess, never going to have sex with him.
No, come on.
Well, they never had another baby anyway.
That's true, but they seem pretty happy together and pretty devoted to each other. They keep reuniting despite the whole family being torn apart by their differing views.
His views are in accord with her right up until this diplomatic incident. He becomes Secretary of State. You get the sense that he rose that high because Diana Wynyard wants him to stop war. All of that would have been interesting to see in the movie, but it really passes in a flash. They skip over those 20 years to get to this future war that they want to dramatize.
He accuses her and women like her for having set the American military back so far that they're not even capable of handling this war.
He's the one that did it. He was the Secretary of State. He's in the government.
Well, she's been Macbething it. This is what I mean. Like, the movie is just so crazily intense in its commitment to absolutely presenting both sides of the issue with maximum force. To the point where, at the end of the movie, I think you're just left in the same position as the women, which is to just feel completely hopeless. Like the men at least all commit themselves eventually to inevitable necessity of going through with this and then seem to cherish a certain feeling of heroism. You know, even Phillips Holmes embraces that. What else has he got at that point? But the women communicate the movie's feeling of absolute despair about this situation because there's just no way around it. If your country's making war far away in Vietnam, you can be a pacifist about that, but if your country is in the process of being bombed, you can't just sit around and let it be bombed.
You know, people always discuss this movie when they discuss it as a film which correctly places the second, even more deadly worldwide conflagration at the right spot on the timeline. But it's not correct in the way that it presents the evolution of the war and the kinds of pacifism that would be there to try to stall the progress of the war, right?
Also, of course, famously and almost uniquely, World War II, because of, the Nazis, because of fascism, actually convinced many pacifists that it had to be fought on moral terms.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm trying to get at here. The opponent is a fictional country called Eurasia, which I can only imagine is referring to the Soviet Union because it spans Europe and Asia. The war itself is envisioned to be something pretty much like World War I. It started over a dumb diplomatic incident, and men can't back down because they're stupid. I mean, that's all that we get there. There is certainly no noble cause here.
But that's accurate as far as World War I goes.
Of course it is. But the thing is, if you're not careful and you want to draw direct parallels and you're saying, well, this anticipates the future in every respect, then the pacifist rallies that Diana Wynyard is leading, you would have to liken them to the America First Nazi rallies, right? Because those were the pacifist rallies that were happening in 1939 and 1940 in the real America.
Well, because by 1933, people know that fascism in Germany is a threat. I kept waiting for there to be some moral issue in entering the war, for that to enter the picture.
That's just not the kind of war that these playwrights and this screenwriter is prepared to deal with. You can't expect it to know.
Yeah, and most wars are stupid.
Definitely. Who knows how these people would have reacted to the real World War II? I guess you could look up the authors and see. But I imagine they would have attacked the problem a little differently if they had known what kind of war this was going to be.
So shall we go through it a little bit and talk a little more about Phillips Holmes' character and his relationship with Diana Wynyard? I don't like the fact that the movie is presented in these gendered terms, that we've had enough female representation in government in North America by now to understand that things are not as simple as this movie is presenting it. But one thing that is interesting as a result of the movie's terms is that Phillips Holmes' character and his performance end up giving a really unusual portrait of a man struggling with trying to figure out a new kind of masculine identity with everybody against him, other than his mother.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not exactly purely gendered terms either. The movie is arguing that only mothers of sons can see the light and understand how insane all of this is. But that doesn't quite work either, because Hedda Hopper does have a son, and she sent him to West Point and is big on him going to get killed. So we have at least one dissenting mother in the film, but every other mother we meet, and there aren't that many.
Well, yeah, they don't say that it's going to be every mother, and they don't say that it's going to be only mothers, because there is that young man at the rally who stands up and says she's right. But, overall, these are the terms we're presented with.
And it's going to be women who have to witness the men that they love go off and get killed for no reason. Because Peggy, fiancé of Phillips Holmes, by the end, she's sounding like Diana Wynyard, and she hasn't even lost Phillips Holmes yet. All she's had to deal with is him flying off, and she's ready to say, no, my son will never fight in the next war.
Yeah, I think the family, and we find this out from the beginning, and from the first moment Peggy's mother, played by Hedda Hopper, is brought to meet Phillips Holmes' family, I think we're supposed to feel that Her family is very conservative and very hawkish.
Yeah, they're gross, and the movie definitely sees them that way. And it's a great scene. Phillips Holmes is joking around about how there were Bolshevik protesters who got into it with some flag-waving rubes on the streets. He's not saying, well, I'm 100% pro-Bolshevik, but he's got more contempt for the flag-waving super patriots. He thinks they're the real problem with the country.
And that seems accurate.
Yeah, it absolutely is accurate. And it's unusual to see that so blatantly stated in a film from this time.
Yeah, and by a character who's remained sympathetic.
Throughout, yeah. The audience is definitely supposed to side with him. He's the one that sounds smart in that confrontation. Head Hopper just wants to leave the house immediately. I think we've heard enough. I don't want to meet your mother.
And then the way he wins Peggy over is just so charming.
Yeah.
He's so amazingly charming in that scene, right? Such a wonderful character. He keeps playing this character as breezy and charming and reasonable, but the more he has to struggle with the question of whether he should fight or not, especially after Lewis Stone acts like a real fuck and decides to suddenly announce to him in the middle of a heated family battle about all of this that, guess what? You don't even get to use my name because I'm not your real father.
Yeah, well, I saw that coming because he made that announcement. No person bearing my name will make statements against the patriotic interest of America.
But even when Phillips Holmes is dealing with that and raising the possibility that his mother has influenced him too much, he's so kind and reasonable to everybody throughout the whole thing. He never throws anybody under the bus.
I probably would have liked the movie more if they had expanded it and given us more of his character and less of this schematic conflict. Because it does feel like a fable in some ways, right? The war is so sketchy, and that's, I guess, by necessity. They're talking about something that hasn't happened yet. But yeah, his character is real and indelible.
But Peggy, by the end, has been won over to their point of view.
I didn't find Peggy very good, the actress. I don't know. And looking at the Wikipedia entry, I see that she is played by Ruth Selwyn, who doesn't have a link on her name. Right. I don't think she's in much. Is she Edgar Selwyn's daughter or something?
No idea. Her character isn't given a lot to do.
No.
It is important that she is won over and comes over to the side of the family, although only after Phillips Holmes also realizes, they kind of each come over a little bit to the other side by the end.
And the scenes where New York is blitzed, I mean, they're terrifying. A believable staging of massive destruction of a modern metropolis. Of course, no one anticipated nuclear weapons, but they're talking about weapons of mass destruction. The exponential increase of the power of chemical warfare, which had started in World War I, and people had attempted to outlaw, but this movie is anticipating this will be a central feature of military strategy in the next war.
Right, of course, as Diana Wynyard bitterly says, I'm sure our chemists will come up with something even worse, don't worry. But it's important that Phillips Holmes, partly he chooses to be a flyer because that is what his father did.
Well, he already has the training. They mentioned that early on, right? But his dad, the Secretary of State, wants him to take a sort of safe, behind-the-scenes laboratory job developing weapons of mass destruction.
Exactly. So I think we're supposed to be putting him, he's the one in the moral dilemma of whether to fight or not. Diana Wynyard isn't. I think we're supposed to be putting ourselves in his position. And obviously as soon as New York is blitzed, well, my reaction, because I was really getting into, as schematic as it is, I was really getting into the drama of, well, that's what this kind of movie is for, right? What would I do? What would I do? Which would I choose? And I would do the same thing that he would do without even being a man, which is why I hate the fact that gender is brought up by him in his decision to fight. That feels like the character's being bent to the movie's schema. I would choose what he was doing. Could not possibly, sit back and let other people die while I'm developing the weapons to kill them instead of offering myself up as a potential sacrifice in self-defense of the country. Don't you agree? And that becomes dramatically interesting because Lewis Stone has to take a moment and realize, in his mind, he wants Phillips Holmes to fight, but he doesn't think of it as sacrificing a son. He's not going to be in the front.
Yeah, I don't know what I would do. I would probably try to go the Lou Ayres route and volunteer for the ambulance corps or something. Absolutely would not kill anybody.
Okay, interesting.
That doesn't come into this movie. They don't mention conscientious objectors. who nevertheless do something ancillary to the war effort.
Exactly, and you're still relying on other people to kill other people in self-defense. And
yeah, of course. The most noble thing I could possibly do, I would think, would be to volunteer. More likely, I would run away to another country. That's how I see myself behaving in these circumstances.
Well, the movie doesn't even raise that possibility, so I wasn't thinking about that.
Well, it's a world war, so there may not be anywhere to go.
Exactly. Is there an underground resistance? No, that's only for when you're being occupied.
Now, the scene with Louis Alberni and Robert Gregg, the butler, it's pertinent here because it once again is showing us the folly, the stupidity, the absolute brainless gender script that these people are following, right? He is their cook. He's gotten along with everyone fine, but he's from Eurasia and he has to leave their employ and go back so that he can try to kill people from the country that he's been living in.
All the men exchange pleasantries about, oh, I like you very much, but I'll kill you on sight. We were actually talking about that the other day. Remember when that football game during World War I was brought up? Over the holidays. Christmas peace between...
well, the belligerent countries in the trenches, right? It's on the Western Front, so the Germans and French and British.
Right, and I was saying we were both agreeing that we did not find this story at all heartwarming because if the men could stop long enough to agree that this was all ridiculous and really we like each other and we just want to be playing a football game, why would they ever pick up arms again? Well, of course, as you then said, because they would have all been executed.
It's a culture of masculinity. It's what the life and death of Colonel Blimp is about in large part, right? You're looking at career military personnel from the era prior to World War II. This great friendship between a British officer and a German officer. They were on opposite sides of the war and they understand that they could have wound up having to kill each other, but they're friends anyway, right? It got the best exploration you could ever get in Colonel Blimp. It's crazy. It makes no sense.
Yeah, because you're always told that soldiers have to be taught to dehumanize the enemy, and anybody has to be taught to dehumanize any group in order to kill them. But how can you flip a switch and switch back and forth between viewing somebody as the enemy and viewing them as less than human and then viewing them as human again?
It is insane, but that is the way a career military officer would have seen things up until, you start getting into things like World War II, possibly. Now, people that are drafted and forced into the army, that is something different, right? These people are not raised to think of it as sporting match between gentlemen. Although that Christmas truce would have been between men who were mostly drafted or conscripted, led by officers that would have had that sporting idea. The only thing you can say about that Christmas truce is it should have boded well for the peace once everyone is told to lay down arms and shake hands, right? They've proved that they can do that. This movie, Men Must Fight, is disgusted with that whole idea, that whole culture that's so ingrained in all of the men that would have been watching it. Something dramatic, some kind of massive intervention is required. Clearly, this movie didn't make the kind of impact it would have needed to make in order to change things.
It made a slight profit.
Well, that's something. The Thalberg regime at MGM is very strange. I mean, they took weird chances. You can see it in something like The Crowd, Freaks. Freaks, of course, they disowned and took the MGM logo off of it, but they paid for it to be made. And this one, I guess it was shown at regular Lowe's theaters for a while.
So again, in terms of what it offers Diana Wynyard, mainly, I'm sure people would have been impressed by her performance at the time, but from my perspective, mainly just how intense and relentlessly forceful she can be, again, in a role that could have been a lot more hysterical and annoying than it is.
She's very good in it, but it's not as multi-dimensional as I want.
It's monomaniacal.
Yeah.
Not multi-dimensional.
Unfortunately, and that's been kind of characteristic of all of the first three films that we've seen her in. Thankfully, I think with Reunion in Vienna, we're going to get to something a little different. So for this film, we do have Leonard Maltin's opinions and information. He gives the movie 3 stars out of a possible 4. Too literal adaptation of Robert Sherwood's dated stage play depends on its star's considerable charm to come across. Barrymore, who seems to have wandered in from another movie, provides most of the film's life with hilarious performances performance as exiled nobleman who returns to Vienna and tries to rekindle a romance with Wynyard under the nose of her tolerant husband, Frank Morgan. The director is Sidney Franklin. Cast list: John Barrymore, Diana Wynyard, Frank Morgan, May Robson, Eduardo Cinelli, Una Merkel, Henry Travers.
So he was veritably prolix in this entry.
Yeah, it gives us a little more to go on than usual.
Do you agree with any of it?
Well, I don't know the play, so I don't know if it's too literal.
How could it be literal?
I don't know.
I can't understand what the metaphor would be if it's literal. I didn't find it dated. It's a pre-code. Pre-codes feel pretty modern.
Yeah, and the whole point of Barrymore's character is that he does come from out of nowhere and shakes things up.
This is as much of a alien performance as an alien, coming from the other end of the class pole as Lionel Barrymore's in Rasputin and the Empress. He's just as obnoxious and disruptive. You can definitely see, this is halfway to screwball comedy. The major element that's missing is that they're not American, that he and Diana Wynyard aren't playing American characters.
No, we're in post-Habsburg Vienna.
But they're nuts and they're violent.
They are. So the movie starts with a tour of Habsburg Palace. The docent is taking people around, keeps telling one grabby visitor to stop handling the drapes, gives an account of a purported secret passage into a little love nest where Prince Rudolph used to tryst with a favorite, court lady. Among the group of visitors here, we find Diana Wynyard, and she tiptoes over toward the wall and imagines pulling open, finding the little cord that opens the secret passage and going in there. Turns out that's all kind of a reverie, and we find her back there by herself. So this woman is the former lover of Prince Rudolph, who's been kicked out of Austria. Obviously, the Habsburgs are a danger to the fucked up and short-lived post-Habsburg Austrian Republic. They keep saying 10 years since the revolution, so it's probably supposed to be 29. Anyway, it's not long before they get their own fascist party. It's more aligned with Italy. Nazis assassinate the leader of the homegrown Austrian fascist party, and by 1938, Austrians are voting en masse to join Nazi Germany.
Well, you can certainly see John Barrymore's character as looking not only toward the authoritarian past, but also toward the fascist future.
Yeah, there are people that are still fiercely loyal to him, particularly Eduardo Cinelli's character. We get a little flashback here where she remembers first meeting Rudolph, being presented to him, and he's, your expected John Barrymore playboy, and she bites his hand. And that gives you a little sense of how she came to his attention in such a forceful way.
Well, he starts by stepping on her dress.
Yeah, exactly.
And trying to force her to kiss his hand, so she bites it.
Yeah, it's awesome. Right away, I liked this movie, and I was like, okay, this is the kind of role I want to see her in.
Maybe you need to see a psychiatrist about that, Dave. This movie's terms are the past, the authoritarian past in which the sexual unconscious lives, which is a very sadomasochistic unconscious, or the modern present, but it's a futuristic present because it is insisting on being absolutely modern and rejecting that past wholesale, is represented by psychoanalysis, by Freud. Here in the person of, well, not Freud himself, but one of the practitioners of his newly created field, Frank Morgan.
Dr. Krug, he is a lecturer at the university, a very famous one who is heard on the radio talking about Austria has to not only politically exile the Habsburgs, but more importantly, they have to get them out of their subconscious. And that's the thing that they really haven't done. And the world would find out by 1938 that they hadn't succeeded in doing it in time to prevent them from joining with the Hitlerian project, which is a horrible thing.
Robert Sherwood apparently originally intended this play to be a satire on science. Luckily, I think the results, at least in this film, with this screenplay, which does have a couple of additional writers, are more complex than that. In other words, Frank Morgan's position, he's rationalizing himself into being cuckolded.
He certainly is.
He is certainly doing that, but the results of it are more ambiguous.
So Frank Morgan, his home life is quite interesting because he's got his dad, who's kind of a bumpkin, played by the great Henry Travers, best known to viewers of our day as Clarence Oddbody from It's a Wonderful Life.
This was his first film, apparently.
Really? Was he in the stage play? Is that possible?
I don't think I found that out, but yeah, he'd been in theater before that.
Well, he's very funny in this movie, I think.
Yeah, he's really hilarious, and he's good and weird.
When he's talking things over with people and giving his own slant on Frank Morgan's activities, he's like, my son is very famous. He went to America. He went to Pittsburgh, told them how to live. Apparently they don't know. Like, just the way he underplays that, it's beautiful. He goes big at times as well, but at the right times, I think. I was really impressed by his performance. I've always loved that guy. And Diana Wynyard, she has become a real convert to the Frank Morgan point of view. We're told that she is the person responsible for the decoration scheme at the home, and every single piece of furniture, every single item in the house is post-Habsburg.
Yeah, and it all looks very Art Deco, which is what I meant by futuristic.
It looks great.
Their apartment looks a little bit like the set for The Black Cat, which is next year.
Of course, it's easy to rearrange your house. Is it as easy to rearrange your psychological being? That is what this movie is asking, and that's what Diana Wynyard is going to have to find out. She's distanced herself from her old crowd, who are all living completely in the past. They're so excited to have their little reunion, and this is where we start to get a sense of her relationship with them. She holds aloof, doesn't want to attend, especially when she learns that Rudolph might be there. There are rumors that he's going to throw caution to the wind, cross the border, just so that he can be worshipped by this bunch of losers.
To me, it seems obvious that the backstory here is that their relationship was literally sadomasochistic. Like, she realizes rationally that that is bad, and she is trying to find some other mode of existence.
Yeah, well, we're told he has inherited several Habsburg characteristics, one of which is, this is absolutely scientifically incorrect as far as I know now, but at the time and in Dostoevsky, you get epilepsy associated with fits of rage and violence.
Sure, but you also know that when John Barrymore is saying that he's full of shit.
Yeah.
And he's beating people up for fun.
Yeah, because he's a megalomaniac.
Yeah, and he's a sadist.
He appreciates the fact that he's able to get away with these things. Actually, we first hear about him through Una Merkel, who's a student of Morgan's.
Yeah, I was not expecting her to show up in that context.
And she comes to see the doctor because she wants to tell him about dreams that she's been troubled by. Dreams which allude back to an experience she had where a cab driver in Nice came back to the passenger seats and sexually harassed her, and she didn't react in the way that she would have expected to. Just by watching all of this and the way Diana Wynyard reacts, we know this is John Barrymore. She knows that he is a cab driver in Nice.
Yeah, Diana Wynyard wears an expression of sexual trance quite a lot in this movie.
She understands what's happened here to poor Una, and it sets the stage too. And Frank Morgan seems to know too, or he's got a kind of a sense. He's not only talking to Una Merkel in this scene, he's saying, let's state the facts clearly. You were attacked basically by a cab driver. Not some exalted being. A low-class creep hit on you, and this should not be a fond memory for you. And he's talking to his wife more than to Una Merkel.
Man who could not, by his own power, rise to a higher station in life than taxi driver. As opposed to me, the famous professor.
Exactly. Frank Morgan defending the meritocratic system that has supplanted the aristocratic one.
It is his position, like a movie star's, but with an authoritarian flavor, that is what makes him so attractive to women, in addition to the fact that he is played by John Barrymore and was probably very good looking about 10 years ago.
So you don't think he's good looking anymore in this movie?
Sexual attractiveness is not what makes his performance interesting. He's giving a scene-stealing screwball performance that definitely makes it understandable why he would be cast in 20th Century the following year. On the stage, this was...
It's a London Fontaine play, isn't it?
Yeah. So how does all of this proceed?
Well, she's dead set on not going to the party.
Right, and this is where Frank Morgan starts rationalizing himself into being cuckolded.
Right, well, he decides that it's no good for her to be fighting this urge. From his perspective, she hasn't conquered the demons in her subconscious, right? She's just trying to repress them. She's not facing them head on, and he thinks that she should, which I guess is good psychoanalysis, right?
Yeah, but he seems to think that the only thing that's going to... Well, there's two components. She has to face that this is not the man of her memory. But he does also seem to be pushing her in the direction of somehow needing to face these demons by sleeping with him.
Well, not necessarily, because he doesn't know that Rudolph is expected. He just tells her that she should go because she needs to face this old crowd.
He tells her to let herself go.
He does definitely tell her to let herself go, which she finally takes as, all right, fine, you asked for it. This is all happening at a hotel run by May Robson,
who's absolutely out of her mind in this movie as well. She's a real nasty piece of work.
Well, she dominates everyone except for John Barrymore.
And she even does her best with him.
And she tries, but
he manages to cow her a few times.
It wouldn't be fun to work for her, I don't think. She's basically still a going concern, right? I mean, she's a holdover from the old days, but she's still a business owner, and she has a place in the modern Austria. All these other people have nothing to do but dream about the past.
John Barrymore's initial approach to her does seem to suggest that he is so sexually omnivorous that they had something going in the past.
That's quite possible. May Robson was a very handsome woman in her day. Still very appealing in the 30s.
Not so much in this role.
Actually, in Men Must Fight, she's very flirtatious with the doctor, right?
That's right. We didn't even, go into her performance in that movie, but she's having a lot of fun as a bohemian, disreputable granny.
Fireworks erupt when Rudolph really does have to smuggle himself across the border. He's got a Tyrolean hat on.
A whole outfit, initially.
He even does some yodeling, but he's disgusted by the fact that he has to affect this pose in order to return to the land that by rights should be his in his mind.
But the only thing he's really interested in making his is Diana Wynyard as soon as he hears that she's there. And he does expect her to be there.
He does, because May Robson says, no, she's not coming. She told me she's not coming. And he's like, nonsense, get her. He is trying to relive the past in many different ways, but especially through this sexual memory.
She was his favorite conquest, evidently, presumably because
she bit him.
Because she fights back.
She slaps him a few times in this movie.
Well, this is what I was saying in our last episode about John Payne and Shelley Winters, that they initially seemed to be able to keep a relationship going on this basis until
it's clear that no, John Payne really, he's been trying that out as a way to engage with her. It's the only language she understands, but he's not enjoying it.
But he wanted a fling and then for her to go away.
Yeah, but here, no, this is something that does excite both of them to some extent, although she's trying to live down that past and move forward into something else. And she does find it all distasteful. She's disappointed by herself and certainly in him, in his behavior.
Well, see, her character is maybe the most enigmatic. Like, we definitely know what John Barrymore wants, and we understand what Frank Morgan is doing, but what is going on with this character? She gets less dialogue than they do, way less.
Oh, but she has such great opportunities.
Well, she's reacting a lot.
It's wonderful.
And she's reacting ironically, right? She's sort of ironically silent while the men are going on.
Oh, yeah. Well, that scene where they're about to engage in fisticuffs and she says, oh, no, I'm just the prize here. Go ahead. I want to see this. I really liked it. She lives in multiple worlds, clearly, and she doesn't have one succinct point of view on all of it, which I think is great. It's believable.
In a way, it's two men fighting for the soul of, although this is more the body of, but fighting for the soul of. But is she going to find some kind of synthesis or some kind of path through this?
Well, one thing that's clear is, of course, she has no interest in continuing through life with John Barrymore. She's not going to run away with him or anything. The only thing she's willing to entertain is reconnecting with him briefly for the few hours that he's permitted to remain in the country. She's just trying to, integrate her past into her present. That's how I would sum up what she's trying to do.
In a way, it feels like a comedic version of unfinished business.
Yeah, I think so.
And I do feel like by the end, Frank Morgan is pushing her toward, he's conflicted. Once he's actually confronted with John Barrymore, he's conflicted. On the one hand, as a husband, he obviously does not want them to sleep together, but as a scientist, he seems to believe that
it might be the only thing.
It's the only thing, but does he believe that because he thinks it will be disappointing to her?
Or just because he trusts in her good sense to know that however the experience goes, it can't continue.
Well, he does say that she is the one who has to bring it to an end.
Right.
He says that, right? So my feeling, as we're watching her react to the men and be pushed this way and that, and try to make a decision, like, she doesn't want to give John Barrymore the victory of sleeping with her necessarily, right? Of reconquering her, particularly now that she's married. She holds that in some value. On the other hand, she knows that she is not over this, and her own husband keeps pushing her to confront it. My feeling by the end is that she feels that she needs to do this to get some closure on the relationship.
Yeah.
That's not going to be, because the relationship was so sexual in nature, she's not going to be able to, neither of them are going to be able to accomplish that without sleeping together again.
Well, because the relationship was ended by political action, not by a natural end point.
Yeah,
right?
As Barrymore says, our relationship was interrupted by the revolution.
Yeah.
The scene where they do, after Frank Morgan has excused himself for the night to allow her to resolve this as she will, she and Barrymore are alone, and they each face the fact, finally, that they are not what they were, and he in particular is not what he was, and that he's pitiable, and she can look at him and honestly say, yes, you are pitiable, and he's like, yeah, you're right. But I thought they created such an interesting mood in that scene, and, throughout the whole course of the development of the relationship in the movie, because it's so silly and so horrible in so many ways. But the mood that they create in that particular scene is the erotic pull of nostalgia.
It's really good.
Even once you face that you're not the same people anymore, nostalgia itself has an erotic pull.
Yeah, I think that's the exact note that they strike. I mean, they deliver perfectly. It doesn't feel silly at all. Maybe the contrast as well makes it all the more poignant, because everything that's come before has been so ridiculous that it kind of takes you by surprise.
And that's why I say that the drama that we see here and where it ends up is much more complex than just being a joke about a scientist who self-cuckolds.
Yeah, I mean, it does have its little joke with John Barrymore eating Frank Morgan's kidneys. Even though it's pre-code, Henry Travers is there to remark upon the added significance of the kidney eating.
He ate your kidneys! He just has to rub it in. But Frank Morgan plays it interestingly, as though he understands this, and it really is okay. It's not an irreparable loss of dignity for him.
Frank Morgan is a great actor.
He really underplays this role.
And we're used to thinking of him as Mr. Matichak or the Wizard of Oz, but here, he's actually quite a threatening looking guy. John Barrymore admits if they have a fight, he's going to lose. That's pretty great. So yeah, Frank Morgan, a sturdy pugilist, finally has to refrain from administering the beating because, as you say, John Barrymore has to be expelled by the action of Diana Wynyard.
Yeah, so his science actually kind of wins in this movie, even though in a painful way, because he actually does pretty accurately diagnose, at any rate, that she is the only one who can conquer this issue, right?
And their marriage will continue and probably will get better after this.
So, that is the fun of the pre-code. And I feel like the elements of that triangle and of the sexual permissiveness are actually handled in a more interesting way here than in that other London Fontan vehicle designed for living.
Oh yeah, I think I probably like this more.
Yeah, I think so too.
Certainly the Lubitsch movie has a lot of high-spirited fun in it.
Maybe this would have been even better if Lubitsch had directed it. There is a Lubitsch frequent screenwriter who worked on it, Ernest Vajda.
Sidney Franklin's a good director, certainly not in the pantheon the way Lubitsch is, but delivers the goods here. And he's ably abetted by his screenwriters and by his cast.
Well, my favorite thing about Design for Living was Miriam Hopkins' horniness. And Diana Wynyard is doing a pretty good job of that in this movie, too. We'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the scene in which she finally breaks down and orgasmically slaps the shit out of John Barrymore.
Isn't that after he's told her to let herself go as well?
Yeah, and then, when she's just sick of these men telling her what she needs.
Yeah, it's great.
When she doesn't know herself.
I think this was a really impressive movie. Do you agree with me? This is the first real Diana Wynyard actress.
Well, I don't actually remember her as vividly in this other movie as you do, so...
Well, it's not the same kind of role as One More River, but it's the same level of complexity.
She did get nominated for the Oscar for Cavalcade.
She did, but it's a fairly one-note performance. She has some nice moments in it. I mentioned the one where she is at the armistice celebration. I thought that was really good, but still, it's all kind of one thing, and it's a unitary presentation of a grieving mother going through hell, right? I mean, that's kind of what she does in that whole movie.
Sure.
Here, she's just so much more of a complete human.
Okay, sure.
And that's what I want from her. And we'll see how much we actually get of that from her. But this is the Diana Wynyard, or the kind of Diana Wynyard movie I was hoping we would see a lot of.
A complete human in a really absurd situation.
Absolutely. Well, One More River is pretty absurd, too.
But yeah, she is definitely in the position of Phillips Holmes's character in this movie. The person who has a real moral and psychological issue. Not only a moral issue, but is grappling with who they want to be, what their persona is, right? We're tensely watching them try to make that decision throughout and to keep a hold of their rationality while doing so.
I was very impressed.
Oh wait, we still have to do Sleeping Beauty.
That's right. Fear and Moviegoing in Toronto. It's our first time going to the cinema in months. That's going to change because we've got a whole slew of movies scheduled. So you'll be getting a lot more of this segment from us in 2025.
Well, providing we can get into them, yes. This is our TIFF Cinematheque retrospective coming up.
I actually re-listened to a little part of our introductory episode for There's Sometimes a Buggy, and we talked about Sleeping Beauty.
We did?
Yeah, because we were talking about early experiences at the cinema.
That's weird.
I mentioned that I saw it at the drive-in, along with Empire Strikes Back. You were talking about how your earliest cinema memories were of seeing Disney reissues.
Yeah, my mom took me to a lot of those in the theater.
So how did Sleeping Beauty strike you this time?
I enjoyed it a lot.
It's my favorite of the Disney movies. Now, I haven't kept up with them. I haven't watched any of the ones released since I was a child. Like, even, I'm talking about Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast. I didn't see those.
There were ones I loved more than this, for sure. Of the princess movies, which in my childhood, the reissues would have been this one, Snow White, and Cinderella. Of the princess movies, this is definitely, it was my favorite at the time.
Well, it's by far the best looking one. It's the most distinctive of the Disney movies.
Right, and the person responsible for that, I found out in my research,
Ivan Durrell.
Ivan Durrell. Walt Disney took a completely different approach to the design of this movie. He was so impressed by Ivan Durrell's backgrounds that he decided to put him in charge of the movie's art design, which caused a lot of tension with the cartoonists, the people responsible for designing the characters, because they were usually setting the tone of the movie. And they decided, I have no idea whether this is true or not, but they decided to object that it was impossible to create cartoons that were consistent with the mood of this design. There were also concerns that the backgrounds were so detailed that they would distract from the characters. And the movie was a box office failure, but of course has since come to be treasured exactly for visual design. Part of the reason it was a box office failure is because it ended up costing an exorbitant amount, which was partly because of these tensions, because of the way Disney wanted to do this one.
Walt Disney, a very complicated figure and not always a savory one from a leftist perspective. But in this respect, I think his autocratic instincts were right. I'm glad he did it.
So the modernist backgrounds in this movie are more reminiscent, although with their own tone and atmosphere, but are more reminiscent of the Looney Tunes backdrops than of other earlier Disney movies.
I'd probably have to watch some Looney Tunes to see where that comparison is coming in. I'll take your word for it.
Well, like the 1950s Looney Tunes backdrops. You've never stopped and marveled at their extraordinary abstract design and psychedelic coloring?
I just haven't seen a Looney Tunes cartoon in so long that I can't really even remember.
I watched them as a child. I actually didn't like them as a child because they were too
Violent?
mean. But I watched them a lot as an adolescent. And as an adolescent, that's when I was really struck by the modernist design of the color cartoons.
Okay, maybe that's what Disney thought he was competing with.
I don't know.
It's a very impressive movie. Maleficent is just terrifying. Certainly as a child, I found, all of her appearances very unsettling, and especially when she turns into a dragon and says that Prince is going to have to deal with her and all the powers of hell. Quite an unexpected line in a Disney cartoon.
It's so nice to watch a Disney movie because I've been subjected to some of them since, watching them with children as the generations go by, children in the family. A Disney movie that doesn't feel the need to be funny at every moment and ironically detached at every moment, other than, one or two little sentimental moments that are revolting and nauseating thrown in. Suddenly you're doing a commercial in the middle of the movie. And I don't know who that's even for, because when I was a child, what was great about this movie? Yeah, the scenes where the animals were acting in cute and funny ways, and I liked the mild humor of the Three Good Fairies and their slapstick antics, but I also really loved being terrified. Like that final sequence with the dragon was absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, I remember cowering in the back of the car at the drive-in.
And in terms of the way that the story is presented, I did find it interesting because I thought once we got into Prince Philip's rescue, once the fairies freed him and we were going to get into his rescue of the princess, I did remember this as being something, like as him being very, very imperiled, but as him accomplishing this task by himself. So when I was watching the movie again, I thought we were going to switch into, hero's journey mode, right, where he proves himself as a man, slaying this dragon and rescuing the princess. But that's not what happens at all. The fairies are actually helping him, even though one of the fairies says to him, I'm going to give you this magic sword and shield because you're going to have to do the rest of this by yourself. They're actually with him, helping him the entire way.
Really, this movie is about Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather learning that they can beat Maleficent. They really stumble badly in the middle of the film because it's their fault that Maleficent locates Sleeping Beauty.
Because they're so silly.
I mean, they were right to put their wands away for 16 years because they can't handle the power, clearly.
No, but they have the silliness of goodness.
They do. Well, they cast the last enchantment over the sword.
I think that they need Philip to provide the true love, but that's his only role. He just has to love and, have a good heart. He doesn't have to be manly, defeating evil by himself.
One thing that I wondered about, it's probably been written about, I haven't done any of the reading that would be necessary to determine that. Maleficent kind of seems a little bit like Sauron in The Lord of the Rings, and she's got these orc-like servitors around her. The Lord of the Rings had been published by 1959 in its entirety, so I'm wondering if there's any connection there, if Walt Disney had read the Tolkien or knew about it at the very least, or his collaborators did.
His writers, I have no idea. I didn't read the entire Sleeping Beauty Wikipedia entry. I did not come across that.
I mean, that scene where she realizes that for the whole time her minions have been searching for a baby is pretty great. She has not got the best help. The only person she can count on is that crow. That's bad management on her part. She should have asked them before 16 years had elapsed whether they were looking for someone in a cradle.
She's just too busy terrifying them.
Yeah, it's a really fun movie. I'm glad we saw it on the big screen.
And I absolutely love the song Once Upon a Dream. It's a wonderful sequence with the forest animals and the prince.
It's beautifully animated, so the animators did get a chance to do some interesting stuff too against those backdrops.
Oh yeah, and the illusion of depth in the movie is so incredible, pre-computers. And of course it also looks better to me than computer animation.
Isn't it rotoscoped? Like they used actual human image capture of motion to...
They did. Oh, and also the reason it's in widescreen is because of the emphasis on the backdrops.
Right. Well, it works really well.
But yes, Once Upon a Dream, my mother was a very good pianist, and we had the Disney songbook, so that was one we played a lot and sang along to.
All right. Well, I think that'll close the book on this week's episode. Next time on the podcast, I hope you'll join us. We are returning to the beginning of the Hollywood studios year by year, back to Paramount 1930. We're going to be introducing a few new wrinkles this go-round. I'm going to be bringing in another favorite book of mine, Forgotten Films to Remember. And for our 1930 episodes for each studio, we're going to give an overview of everything we watched during the first sequence of 1930 to 1948. Maybe talk about what we've learned and some favorite films that we saw.
So in the new year, even longer episodes.